G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. This morning I watched a video posted by a tuber called Desertphile. A fella called Dave, lives on a cattle ranch in New Mexico. Sometimes he gets accused of being an Australian, but he's not an Australian. I am an Australian. So anyway, Dave told a couple of stories, one of which was about a bloke who rang the police, wanted him to bring him a dog who could sniff out heroin because his girlfriend had stolen his heroin supply. Which is a remarkably logical thing to do if you're particularly stupid. He told another story about a couple of drug users who were found unconscious in a car locked up, parked, with two children in the back seat, and they were parked out the front of the police station. And he asked, what's going on in the world? He wondered whether perhaps the drug users unconscious in the car with the children were trying to get their kids taken off them by the authorities. I don't think that'd be it. If you wanted to get your kids taken off you by the authorities, you could surrender them without that drama. Just take them to the police station or the hospital. I think what's happened is it's a case of somebody who was hanging out, withdrawing, couldn't help themselves but to shoot up as soon as they got a hold of a supply. I think that means that they've driven their car and parked it out the front of the police station because that's where they figured they could score their drug. So either the street dealer in that part of the world figures the detectives are too preoccupied to look in the street in front of the police station and that's a good place to deal drugs, or they used too much and they overdosed themselves accidentally, perhaps because the drugs came out of the evidence room in the police station that they were parked in front of. The other possibility is that the two drug users just wanted to commit suicide and they didn't want their kids to be left unattended in the house wherever else they might have been to do such an act. But like I said, Dave wanted to know what's going on in the world. And one of the things that I've been thinking about for a while is bad parenting. Most people don't actually parent their kids as well as your average marsupials, right? I mean, here we have mummy kangaroo. Here we have the local ranking alpha male kangaroo. That's Billy Longarms with his split ear, bullet split ear. And that's Dizzy, the disabled kangaroo who's had cut feet healed 3 times. And there's Dizzy's footling, a little doe. The only doe in the current run of footlings. And they're just sort of quietly hanging out. And what's going on at the moment is she's got a joey in the pouch. She's just about in estrus, so he's run off all the other males and he's keeping a close eye on her. And they'll probably start another joey in a day or so. Meanwhile, the footling's about a year old, I'd say. And she's been in the pouch and been carried all over the total territory that Dizzy knows, which goes probably 200 to maybe perhaps 500 metres in every direction from here. And she's been shown everything in the pouch. And then she's been shown everything following her mother. And she's still occasionally milk fed. And in about another year, she might be old enough to try having her first joey. And the idea is that the parents, or stepfathers in some of these cases, uncles, big brothers, whatever, they actually take the individual around and show them precisely how their world works. And by the time they become an adult, they know every tree and rock and fold in the ground. They know where it's dangerous. They know where it's warm on a cold day, where it's cool on a hot day. So they get to be culturally fitted into their personal micro-environment. It means that they're not only evolutionarily, genetically designed to live here, they're epigenetically fine-tuned to live here. And I think there was a lot of that kind of pedagogy and child raising philosophy in the traditional Australian Aboriginal way of raising your kids. You didn't sort of stick your kids in long stay daycare when they were supposed to be being cuddled while they were breastfed. You carried the kids around until they could walk, and then they toddled around role modelling on the adults and learning about their environment. So by the time they were ready for manhood or womanhood initiation ceremonies, they understood their landscape. And the DNA Nation project has shown that in Australia, people lived on the same part of the landscape for 50,000 years. Came across the land bridge from New Guinea? Yeah, sure. Found out around the coast? Yeah, it took 1,000 years to do that. After 1,000 years, everybody had their territory and they stayed there, and ice ages didn't shift them. It's pretty impressive. And once upon a time, more or less up to a point, before the harvest everythingists started their broadacre agro cult in Göbekli Tepe in Turkey 10,300 years ago, when the hunter-gatherers were no longer able to keep the meat and the grain and the fruits up to the stonemasons who were building a monolithic carved, engraved stone, some kind of a site, monument, religious telescope, whatever it was. 300 years after the midden started to appear, the first hybrid grains appeared in the midden. And that's the first place that agriculture got its start, the idea of sowing seed and harvesting everything. And of course, eventually that created a local desert, and that part of the country became barren, and then people backfilled the stone monument, covered it up with sand. And when it eventually grew grass on it, they grazed a few goats there. But the harvest everything cult spread out. And yeah, they had the Renaissance in Europe after, 5,000 years of various imperial aggrandizement attempts by various tribes who wanted to own everything. After they overpopulated and overharvested and denuded their own home local terrain, so therefore they decided to go and conquer the resources of the neighbouring tribe. Once the industrial agricultural revolution kicked off and got first coal-powered and then oil-powered, there was less ability in the dark satanic mills to have your kids at foot. They'd keep getting sucked into the machinery and all the rest of it. The idea back then was to have the mother at home looking after the kids while the father went out to make the money that make the whole thing possible, because in the industrial world in Europe, anyway, you just couldn't be a subsistence hunter-gatherer free-range human. You had to plug into the economy somehow. There was no social safety net. World War I put women into the workforce and children into the hands of aunties and grandmothers and anybody who basically wanted to look after them. After World War I, the industrialists wanted women to keep working so that they could have wages, so that they could consume more. World War II did it all again. By the time World War III was a distinct possibility on the horizon in the 50s and the 60s, the idea was that women should aspire to not ever looking after their own kids because they could pay some other idiot to do it. The fact that if you've got daddy's a lawyer and mummy's an accountant, he gets $500 an hour and she gets $300 an hour because they're rinky-dink top dollar ones, then their kid sort of really needs $500 an hour worth of brain work put into their infancy, their toddlerhood, their babyhood. Their anthropologists and sociologists have discovered that around about 25 times a minute, a baby chimpanzee looks towards its parent and coughs or whimpers or moans or makes a noise. And every time the parent hears the offspring make the noise, the parent turns around and looks and they lock eyes. And 25 times to 35 times per minute for the first 3.5 years they're awake, human infants, which are, we're primates, they do the same. They make a tiny little whimper and they look in the direction of their regular loving carer. So that can be parent, sibling, aunt, uncle, next door neighbour, somebody that infant knows and relies on. They look towards them and they expect to lock eyes. And when somebody sticks their kid in front of Sesame Street and has the television being a babysitter, that doesn't happen because the television doesn't pick up on the cues. And the kid starts out in infancy with a damaged self-esteem. It's a society that's designed to support an economy because some people can get rich, and it's not convenient for the people who want to get rich to give the proletariat, the peasantry, the vast amorphous, perhaps unwashed masses, time to raise their children to be well-mannered, informed, functional citizens and members of a mature society. So that lawyer married to the accountant I was telling you about, they stick their kid in daycare and they leave it with a teenager who dropped out of school at 15 or 16 and is on maybe 75% of an ordinary wage as a training wage because they're doing a correspondence course in childcare. And that kid that might be on perhaps $15 an hour, they're going to be looking after 5 or 8 toddlers. So daddy at $500 an hour, mummy at $300 an hour, the kid's not getting $350 an hour worth of childcare. The kid's lucky to get $3 an hour worth of actual attention from a dedicated, regular, loving carer. So this means that increasingly the past 75 years, 100 years, there's been a greater and greater chunk of the population who's always got that burning, empty hollowness driving them on. The upper classes in Britain send their kids off to boarding school so that they can suffer complete parental abandonment and grow up with an overcompensated inferiority complex, which they will work out by dominating the economy around them and the society around them. And it's great if you want empire builders and empire keepers. Yeah, the British public school system. So at the moment, we've got people who are in their 30s or so who've grown up on really violent video movies, really violent video games, internet video games, first-person shooter video games. There are people who think that it's fun to spend 15 hours a day driving a virtual car along virtual streets, running over virtual pedestrians. And then when their life turns to shit, you know, like when they have to go to court to front up charges of domestic violence and a domestic violence order, instead of going to court, the dickhead in Melbourne a little while ago picked up his girlfriend, drove in circles and did donuts around the suburbs for an hour or so, let her out, and then laid more donuts before setting off on a ram raid towards the railway station in the middle of Melbourne. Killed about 5 people. Somebody in Bunbury in Perth decided he didn't like being an out-of-work miner living in a caravan park after the mining boom. So he got in his four-wheel drive and drove up the wrong side of the freeway, forced some people off the road till he head-on collided with one. There's a lot of angry people out there. Here in New South Wales this week, they announced what amounts to a thought crime unit. It's to be called the Fixated Persons Investigation Unit. There's 17 detectives. I've heard there's as many as 54 people in there, so that means there's another 37 psychiatric nurses and psychiatrists and psychologists. And they're looking for people who have the capacity to mount a lone wolf attack after becoming rapidly radicalised along religious, ideological or political lines without being connected to any group which stirs them up or gingers them up or gets them to act. So yeah, we've got apparently 54 people on Big Brother's Thought Crime Unit operating out of Sydney, because the federal anti-terrorism, anti-radicalisation unit hasn't got the price of a car to drive to their interviews with their suspects with. So yeah, that's kind of what's going on, Dave. I think the world's going to hell in a handbasket because your average kangaroo knows more about how to raise a Joey into being a functional grown-up than your average human being does. Look to the kangaroo, look to the swamp wallaby, consider their ways and try and do better. We must do better. Because at the moment, it's embarrassing to have kangaroos being better parents than most of the people I know. At least from listening to them on the radio and the TV and all the rest of it. Not talking about people I know personally, although some of them could benefit from paying attention to kangaroos too. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.